Our final presenter is Grace Lohr. She's a lecturer at the University of Victoria and a senior researcher with Equal Voice, and that's an organization dedicated to electing more women to all levels of government across Canada. Grace has a PhD in political science from UBC, where she studied the relationship between electoral systems, women's political representation, and the representation of gendered policy issues. As part of that work, she interviewed more than 80 elected women in 6 countries. Grace was also a candidate for Victoria City Council in the 2018 municipal election. And Grace Lohr, welcome to the podium.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers and the panelists and to you for being here. We're having conversations about how to do democracy, how we want to choose our representatives. But it's important for us not to lose sight of the fact that we're doing democracy right now, too. These conversations, your voting, we're doing democracy about how we're going to do democracy. So I think these conversations that we're having about the systems available and evidence-based discussions are really important in that process. So, so I'm going to, in some ways, pick up where Professor Johnson started and talk some more about what electoral systems mean for women's representation, what it means to talk about women's representation, and what we may anticipate from the systems on offer. So where are we? Well, BC has 38% women in the provincial legislature. Up until recently, that was the highest in the country. We've now lost some ground to other provinces. So while it's quite a bit higher than it is federally, where just 1 in 4, slightly more than 1 in 4 of our MPs are women, we have seen a real slow progress. In the 2017 election, representation increased by just 1 percentage point, and that was actually erased when Christy Clark resigned her seat and there was a by-election. So we really didn't see change over that election. So parity, 50-50, still seems elusive in the Canadian context and in much of the world, so it remains an important question. As was already noted, there's a general consensus in the research that proportional representation systems do elect a higher proportion of women than those countries that use single-member first-past-the-post systems. Okay? This is just some rough grouping of countries in 2016 that was done by the Interparliamentary Union. But over time, and as Dick's graph showed, we do see a real difference in terms of proportional systems and first-past-the-post systems. Ooh, some formatting was lost here. Okay, that's fine. I will tell you what it says. Of the top 25 countries, 17 do use proportional representation. So this is just a list of how countries are doing in terms of women's representation. Okay, so we do see that in this list of 25, proportional representation is much more common, right? But it's important for us to have a sense of why. If we think part of the reason we might want to move to a new system, among other reasons, but part of a motivation might be to increase women's political representation and participation, we should have a sense of the dynamics that are at play. There's a few things worth considering. But one of the key factors in increasing the number of women elected is the same thing that increases proportionality, the number of representatives per district, this notion of district magnitude. How many MLAs do you have representing your district? Why? By being able to run more than one candidate, and in some cases being able to run quite a few number of candidates, parties don't have to pick the sort of single most acceptable candidate, right? Parties can choose a variety of candidates. They're also not confined to rerunning one incumbent, right? And if women are underrepresented in politics, then we know that incumbents are more likely to be men. So this increases opportunities for parties to run more diverse candidates. Critically, PR systems are easier to combine with quotas. So part of the dynamic that we see behind proportional representation and women's representation is the role of quotas, right? If you only can pick one candidate, it's much harder to determine or to demand that parties run a certain number of women across the province, right? More party control over a number of candidates in a district actually increases opportunities to overlay a proportional system with quotas that are actively seeking to increase representation. The other element, of course, is the ways in which proportional systems elect more parties on the left. We know women are more likely to run with, and parties on the left are more likely to run more women. Okay, so these are some of the dynamics behind the representation of women in PR systems. But even this is an oversimplification. Okay, the relationship between electoral systems and women's representation has been simplified in the discussion. And since we're doing democracy right now, I think it's worth breaking it down. So this is a figure from some Fair Vote materials. What's observable here is that PR systems elect more women than those with first-past-the-post systems. Unfortunately, this image includes data that's 5 years old on the one hand, right? If we looked at it now, France with a single-member district, not plurality, but majority, is actually doing very well right now, right? We're also missing in this graph the fact that Germany is actually a mixed system, so a number of those women are elected under a first-past-the-post system, okay? So I really want us to do a good job of thinking about how representation happens and what we can expect from the new systems, okay? Part of that involves thinking about just what we mean by the representation of women. We can pull this concept apart as well. On the one hand, we've got descriptive representation, right? It's the extent to which representatives resemble those they represent. So in this case, we just mean the number of women elected, right? That's almost exclusively what I've been talking about so far. But we might also want to think about what we call substantive representation. The extent to which the activity of representatives, what they do and say, is in the interest of those they're representing, okay? So we might think about the prioritization of particularly gendered issues or the gendered lens on policy issues. And while these things are related, they're not the same thing, okay? Women in politics are more likely to raise gendered issues or come from a gendered perspective, but that, like the number of women elected, depends a lot on the electoral system. So here is a bit of the nuance that we need to bring into the discussion. On the one hand, descriptive representation, the number of women elected, increases with larger district magnitudes, with quotas that are easier to overlay on top of proportional systems, and with closed lists. Why closed lists? Well, if parties are willing and interested in increasing the number of women elected, they can make sure that their lists reflect the diversity of the province. Okay? To some extent, we're relying on parties to do that, right? But one thing we see is that with lists, you can actually see who parties are running. It's more visible. We can get some public accountability for who are running. This is not to say that women aren't able to pull in those votes for them personally, right, when we have more open lists, but we know the gendered context, right, of the gendered wage gap, gendered political networks, access to financial and other political resources mean that running independently or running for your own personal votes has a gender dynamic to it that makes election under those systems more difficult for women. Here's the flip side. Substantive representation, the amount women do to speak to raise, to prioritize gendered issues actually increases when those lists are open. Part of what they do with some of that freedom from their party, part of what they do in an effort to pull in those individualized votes in open list systems is speak to gendered issues or to issues from a gendered lens. Similarly, multiple votes for voters. So if you get to go in and rank your candidates, choose your favorites, right? And that actually impacts who's elected. While it has the impact of reducing the number of women elected, those women tend to do in politics, once they're elected, more to raise the profile of issues that have significant gendered impacts. So to some extent, we see a push and pull here in terms of what we mean by women's representation, what it is we want from our system, okay? So we can keep these things in mind in determining what kind of system we anticipate meeting our needs. Okay. So, what do we expect from the systems on offer? Dual member proportional? This system is absolutely compatible with efforts to increase the number of women elected. A sufficient number of women occupy that first spot on your ballot, the first spot for their party, we will see the election of more women, and it is, I think, there's a very real possibility with the effort from parties and demand from voters, a move to parity under this system, right? At the same time, individuals will be a bit, need to navigate their party's internal system to access that first bit, access that first spot, and so may have folks doing more of their party bidding than prioritizing gendered issues if it's not on the table. Okay, so again, that push and pull. Mixed member, it depends. A good portion of the seats under this system, right, as Dr. Cameron laid out, are still elected under our current system. So we wouldn't expect much to change there. But then we have these others who are elected under a proportional system. The thing is, we don't quite know what that looks like yet. We don't quite know who you will vote for, if you vote for a candidate or a party, right? We don't know how big those regions are. So there's a real possibility to increase the number of women elected here. But in the Bavaria version of this system, actually it's made it difficult for women to get elected under MMP, okay? So there's still work to be done on this system to have a good sense of what it will mean. Rural urban. Okay. Women among candidates are likely to increase, but urban areas may or may not elect substantially more women. We don't quite know how this will work because currently there's no evidence that voters discriminate against women at the ballot box. The party signifier is so important, it overrides any sort of perception of candidates. But we might have a situation where, as I said, those gender differences in access to political resources may make it difficult for women under STV. On the other hand, we may see people distributing their votes with this in mind, okay? And again, in the rural areas, it depends the particular form of MMP, right? How people are voting. So I'll just close with what's the work left to do, okay? Because there are some questions about our systems that are up for your vote, that are unsettled, right? These decisions will be made after the fact, and they have real impacts on the prospects for women to be elected and what we can anticipate women to do once they're elected. So this is something we should all have our eye on the other side of this. If this is an issue you care about, then thinking about the particular form of that system and the details, right? Well, details. No, the details matter. They're substantial in terms of women's representation. And then I think as we're revisiting this electoral process in relation to women's representation, we should look at the nomination process. This is a huge thing, right? Way before someone's casting your ballot, you're self-selecting into politics, and then you got to get on that ballot. And there's lots that happens there that significantly impacts women's likelihood of success and even participating in the first place. This falls outside of Elections BC's hands right now, but that's not the case in every province, and we can revisit it for rules around money, predictability, etc. That will make a huge difference no matter what the system looks like. And then finally, we have public funding for parties as a bridge in this time when we've reduced the amount people can donate and spend. New Brunswick has just used, for the first time, a proactive policy to get more women elected. All they did was tie this public funding to parties based on the gender of the candidate that was being voted for. The per vote subsidy was higher for women than it was for men. This encouraged parties to run more women and run them where they were likely to get votes. The party's bank account depended on it. So in this period of time where we have public funding for parties, which we hadn't in the past, there's an opportunity here, if we're serious about increasing women's representation, to use this in any of the systems we choose. So again, work left to be done, and work that will continue after the election to keep our eye on this particular issue. Thank you all.